Does everybody hear me?
Yes, sir.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for having me here today. And I want to read you a story about a woman who tried to have an abortion and failed, thank God. I'm going to share with you a true story about a woman who tried to abort her child but failed. It happened in December 1947 near Clovis, New Mexico. Her name was Clementine, and she was living in an abandoned, run-down cabin in rural New Mexico, about 7 miles from Clovis. Clementine was living in this cabin with her husband and 3 sons. 2 were her children, and 1 was her husband's child from a previous marriage. One day her husband told her that he was going to go to town. They had no car, so he started walking towards town. That evening, when he did not return, she was not really worried until she climbed into her pallet bed on the floor of the cabin. Inside the blankets was a note from him. He told her that he was leaving for California to find his siblings. He had not left 1 penny for her to feed the children or herself. She not only did not have a car, she did not know how to drive a car. Her stepson, who was 13 years old, hunted for rabbits every day to help keep them from starving. Once a week, he would walk or hitchhike into Clovis to get food rations from the state of New Mexico. $3 per week for 3 children and Clementine. He would buy flour, sugar, salt, and other things that they needed to survive. One day, Clementine felt some familiar feelings. The more she thought about it, the more she was convinced that she was pregnant. A parting gift from her worthless husband. And the next day, she walked to a neighbor lady's house and asked if she could get a ride to town to see a doctor. The neighbor lady took her to town a few days later, and the doctor confirmed her suspicions that she was indeed pregnant, and that she was anemic from lack of food and lack of nutritious food. That night, she waited until the boys were asleep. She found an old coat hanger and tried to end her pregnancy. It was a desperate attempt to save her boys and herself from starving. She bled for several days and passed out a few times from lack of blood. Once the bleeding stopped, she felt a little better, and she assumed that she was no longer pregnant. Soon she started working for the neighbor lady to earn a few dollars a week to help buy more nutritious foods for her and the boys. After a couple of months, she began to realize that she was still pregnant. She felt the desperation returning and the thoughts about her trying the coat hanger again. But that day, a letter came in the mail from her sister-in-law in California. With the letter were bus tickets for her and her 3 boys. The next day, they made their way to Clovis for the last time and boarded a bus for Sacramento, California. It was a 2-day ride on the bus for all of them, with very little food and drink. However, the other passengers were eager to help her, and they bought food and drinks for her and the boys. The best thing about that trip was it gave her hope, something she had very little of, living in that run-down cabin in the middle of nowhere. Clementine was so happy to see her sister-in-law waiting at the bus station when they pulled into Sacramento. And 3 boys were now in much warmer climate and had lots of family close by to help them. Once Clementine's husband found out that she and the boys were in town, he came to get them and moved them into his tent in a huge tent city in South Sacramento. They lived in that tent for several months alongside many family members and strangers alike. Her husband had a good job for once in his life, and with a growing family, they bought 2 acres of land, which had an old livestock barn on it. They modified the barn into a barn house, which was much nicer than the tent or the old rundown cabin that they had lived in previously. Clementine's conditions had changed for the better again. Soon after that, they moved into the barn house. The son that she had conceived in Clovis, New Mexico, was born with a hole in his spinal column called the spina bifida. The spinal cord was sticking out of his skin, and the doctors told her that her son needed immediate surgery to put the cord back inside the spinal column, and of course she said, yes, do it. She had many thoughts about the coat hanger cutting into the spinal column and causing the spina bifida. The doctors then told Clementine and her husband that their newborn son would die before he reached the age of 2, because that was the prognosis for babies born with spina bifida. Even with the baby having only 2 years to live, she could see that her life had improved drastically in the last 6 months. Now she had a barn house on 2 acres that they were buying. He had a job that paid very well, and food was not an issue anymore. In fact, they had a refrigerator filled with fruits and vegetables that they were growing in their own garden. 21 months later, Clementine gave birth to another son. He was very healthy and had no health issues. This made her think that she had caused the spina bifida once again. Soon after that son was born, Clementine's husband abandoned them all and moved away again. This time she'd had it with them and filed for divorce. She was granted custody of their children, and he got the older son from the previous marriage. He was ordered to pay child support for the children, but he disappeared and she never got a penny from him. However, she ended up with the property, the barn house, and being free of her worthless husband was a great thing too. She struggled to make the payments on the property, so she got a job at a local cannery during the day shift. Her sister-in-law worked the night shift, so they traded off watching each other's children, which was a very common practice in those days. There was a rental house on the adjacent 2 acres from Clementine, and a new renter moved in with 5 girls and a boy. The man was a widower who worked hard every day to support his family. His older daughters watched their younger children while he was at work. Eventually, Clementine and the widower met, and he fell in love with her immediately. He told everyone that she was the most beautiful woman that he had ever met. They fell in love and were married. Clementine had 4 boys, and he had 5 girls and a boy. Now the 10 kids living in one house with 2 parents were going to make life work for them. Clementine had always wanted to have a baby girl, and since her husband had 5, she figured it was destiny. So she got pregnant, hoping for a little girl. On November 8, 1955, they had a bouncing baby boy. He had bright red hair like her and big blue eyes like him. Now they had 11 kids, and many times the stepson who got dropped off somewhere in Sacramento to make his way to her house for a place to stay. Clementine's new husband was a hard worker, and his boss heard that they were living in a barn with 11 kids. So he offered them one of the houses that they were tearing down to build a freeway in Sacramento. When Clementine heard about it, she exclaimed that it was a blessing from God. The entire family had been going to church and praying for a better house, and God was giving it to them. All they had to do was earn it by tearing off the upper story of the house that was located 7 miles from their property, and then have a foundation poured to set it on. The day after the house was chosen, they started moving everything they owned into tents in their backyard. So now they were living in tents again, taking a step backwards to move several steps forward. As they were taking apart the barn house, they used the materials to build a horse barn, a cow barn, and goat sheds behind the backyard, where all the animals were being raised for food, not including the horse. The kids all had jobs to do, like straightening out nails so they could be reused. Digging a septic tank for the new house had bathrooms, unlike the 2 outhouses that were used at the old barn house. Every weekend, the boys and the husband drove to the new house and worked to tear off the roof and the upper level of the house so it could be moved the 7 miles to their property. Soon, it was moving day. They all had jobs. the house arrived on a lowboy trailer made for moving houses. It looked so fancy sitting there on the site of the old barn house. It took only a few weeks to get the house back together, and then they moved in. Now Clementine was living in a 4-bedroom, 1.5-bath house with a new husband and 11 kids. Her circumstances had changed again for the better. A real house, a real husband, and a much better life than she had ever hoped for. It was not an easy life, but at least there was so much more hope and possibility. One day, about a year after the house was all finished, her son, who was born with spina bifida, who was miraculously still alive and very well at 13 years old, went into the back of the house from the outside to use the half bathroom. While in there, he could hear his mother talking on the phone to a neighbor. That lady was considering an abortion, and Clementine was explaining to her about what had happened to her son, whom she happened to call by name. So his ears perked up, and he got closer to her so he could hear what she was saying. When he heard what she had done to try to kill him, he was devastated and had to go outside so his mom would not hear him crying. About an hour later, his brother, who was about 18 months older, found him crying in the barn. When he was asked why he was crying, he got no answers, so he went to get his mom to see if she could find out. When Clementine asked what was so wrong that he was crying, when she had seen him with broken bones and really hurt and had never seen him crying like this. At first he wouldn't say anything, and then he blurted out to her, "Why did you try to kill me when I was still inside you?" For the longest time, Clementine had no answers for him, but finally she began to try to explain to him what her circumstances were at the time. He was so hurt that he could not even begin to understand what that had to do with anything. All he knew was that the one person that he loved, respected, and adored more than anyone else in the world had tried to end his life before he was born. He was crushed to his core and wanted to be alone. After weeks or possibly months, he was able to look at her again, and they made up to each other and moved on with love in their lives for each other. When he turned 18, he joined the Marines and went off to war in Vietnam. Even though most of the other recruits found the Marine Corps difficult, he did not because of the way that he was brought up. In fact, he flourished because he was in top physical condition. Excuse me. Before my nose started running. I guess something else is running too. He was in top physical condition and was used to working hard every day. He got 496 points out of a possible 500 points in the physical fitness test. Only 11 Marines had ever gotten 500 points in well over 100 years of testing. While he was in the service, Clementine wrote to him every week, and he wrote back just as often. He never told her of the danger that he was in because he knew that she was already worried about him. Once he got out of the Marines, he went to college and was on the Dean's Honors List every semester for the first 2 years. Clementine and her husband were so proud of him for going to college that they even had a special dinner for him to celebrate the occasion. After 2 more years of college, he became a pretty successful businessman. He was making more money than he needed, and so he chose to help his parents as they were not set up like most retirees. He paid for a new car for them. He bought them anything that they wanted, including washers, dryers, freezers, riding lawnmowers, etc. When Clementine died at the age of 70, her son, who loved her so much, went to her and held her for hours in the driveway of her home. As the other brother showed up, only one asked to hold her. So he helped put her in her other son's arms. The next day, the oldest brother was searching Clementine's house for a will. When he found it, he handed it to the brother, who was born with spina bifida, and said, You've always been Mom's favorite, and now you're her administrator of her will. Over the next few days, all of his brothers told him the same thing, that he was always Mom's favorite. He had never thought that was so, and did not want to tell them what had happened so many years ago. So he went to a psychic medium who contacted his mother and told him that his brothers were right. He was always his mother's favorite. Now I got to tell you that nobody talked to the medium to tell her what the brothers had said. I know that this is a true story because I am the child that my mother tried to abort. The photo on the cover was me winning a baby beauty contest in Sacramento, California in 1949. Later I had a family of my own and never once thought of aborting my son, who I am so proud of. He is the father of my 2 grandchildren. I have a very exciting life, and I had lots of love and lots of sadness like most everyone else, but I was fortunate to have my life. The message that I would like to convey here is that if you have an abortion, that is between you and God. Your circumstances will change, so do not have an abortion because of your present circumstances. Pray to God and let Him help you. And then natural, you may not see how you can change, but God is supernatural, and He can do things that you haven't even considered yet. You could be killing the one child who will love you more than anyone else, and the one who turns out to be your favorite child. This is probably the most difficult thing that I've ever written, because it is about the person that I loved the most as a child, and it is so personal. My love for my mother was so strong that in time I completely forgave her for trying to abort me. However, I do not know if she was ever able to forgive herself. So I pray to her in heaven to be forgiven by herself and by God. Do not ever give in to fear. Always choose love. Love is the #1 word in the Bible. Choose love. And now if anybody has any clarifications or questions, I'd be more than willing to answer that. Nothing? Wow.
Thank you. Thank you.
As part of this testament, I would like to say that I owe my wife for bringing me back into the fold of the Lord. We met about 32 years ago in Sacramento. And one of the first things she asked me is, would you go to church with me? And I said yes. And that changed my life. She changed my life. God changed my life. And relating to a lot of the things that were up here this morning, I just want to say that, you know, when I was a child going to church, we didn't have any money. But we got kicked out of the church when I was 14. And the pastor was arguing with my father outside when I went out to use the outhouse in the church because it was so old they didn't have bathrooms. And the pastor told my father if he couldn't pay more tithings, then he was going to have to leave the church with his kids.
Wow.
And so on that day, they kicked us out of the church. And my father never went back to church until I got married in a church. And a lot of my family stayed out of the church. But thank God, Robbie got me back into it. And anyway, as far as the tithings go, my parents were paying all that they could afford. I mean, we were walking around barefooted. My dad cut our hair. We didn't have anything special. We grew almost all of our own food or hunted for the rest. And all of us had to go to work, start paying rent by the time we were 16 years old. So that was my dad's way of moving you out of the house as an independent human being. But when I started going to church with Robbie, I saw her pitch in at 20, so I pitched in at 20. And I thought, well, God says He's going to multiply that. And let me tell you, it started with that 20, but it just kept going up and up and up because the money just kept flowing in, and our lives kept getting better and better and better. And we've been able to do a lot of things with our life, but I know it's all because of God. And like I said in that booklet, there's so many things that I've done that are exciting, but none of that means anything without God, because I wouldn't have it without God. If there are no questions or anything else, I'm done.
I'll get it afterward.
Okay.
Praise God. I pray that you are encouraged. That's why we ask testimony. That's why we ask people to share what's their life's about. I always say, when you come to church, the person sitting left or right to you probably has a more powerful testimony than you could ever